Hi everybody. So this video is going to continue where I left off last time and finish making the simple Pong game. So up to this point, the game has been able to put a ball on the screen that bounces around off of the walls and off the paddle. However, it doesn't keep score. The game doesn't really get harder over time. And if you miss the ball, as of right now, nothing happens. And the way it's supposed to work as a hyper simplified version of Pong, you're really just trying to not miss the ball, and it'll just keep score by giving you a point for as long as you're able to, a point for each time you hit the ball. A super simple version. So a few things to add. One of them is keeping score. Another is increasing the ball speed so that the game gets a little bit harder. And another is some sort of game over function that should have like a message pop up on the screen and say when the game is over, and stop the game. So what I'm gonna do first is take care of the scorekeeping. So scorekeeping, that is going to require having a score variable. So I have my global variables defined up here at the beginning. I'll define another global variable, score. Start that at 0. And what I'll do is first, not even going to modify the score yet. Well, I suppose I could. It really doesn't take much to keep track of the score. That's just when the way I had it set up in the demonstration back in part 1 was just every time you hit the ball you get a point. Well, that's pretty straightforward to set up because in the ball class, in the move method, every time there's a collision with the ball and the paddle, that global score variable can just increase. So if I'll just do that right here. Score plus equals 1. Now, one problem with this is there is no local variable score. You need to use global score. The way you specify global in a local scope in Python is just use the global keyword. So I'm going to say global score, and this is just being clear that I'm using that global variable. And the reason I'm using a global variable is just that multiple things need to access it, and there isn't really much risk of modifying this data in a way that you don't want to. It's really simple, it's really straightforward, and I really just want to be able to have, instead of passing this around and returning something from wherever it's being passed to, this is simple enough and unlikely to break enough that I'm just going to use a global variable. It's not usually encouraged using global variables when you have a lot of when you have classes and methods and functions being defined. But in this case, it's such a simple situation. There isn't much risk of breaking anything. So I'm just going to use global score here and increase that score whenever there's a collision. And then the next thing I'll need to do is display it on the screen. So displaying it can happen down where in my game loop where I update and display things here. I'm going to create another object to draw onto the screen, which is going to be a font object. I'm going to say score surface equals score. I think I don't have a font object yet. So the surface is where I'm going to draw it, but I need to create a font object. That's something particular to Pygame. So I'll pause this for a minute. I'll be defining this later. First, I need to create score font. This is going to be outside of my loop. So back outside of the loop, where I have my setup and my globals. I'm going to create a score object. So that'll be out right after I set score equal to 0. I'll say score font equals Pygame dot font dot sys font. This is just going to use system fonts, and George is a pretty common one. It's pretty likely to work on any system. And I'll set the font size to 30. So this creates a Pygame font object. Defines the font and the size, and that's in the variable score font. So now back down here inside my loop, where I was creating a surface to draw, Pygame needs to draw on surfaces. So the score surface will be the surface to draw the score onto. And I will do score surface equals score font dot render f string score curly braces score. After the string, it takes a couple arguments. One is a Boolean, false. I'm defining it as false. It has something to do. I forget what this argument even is. I can look it up. It has something to do with the way it renders the font. I don't think it's really worth looking into at the moment. But it takes a Boolean as an argument. I'm setting it to false, and then it takes a color as an argument. If I want my score to be red, I'm going to go back and define red. So let me go back to my global variables, define red. And in this case, I don't even need a color picker for this one. It's RGB color. So R is the first thing. I'm going to max out red at 255, 0, 0. So, it's the three components of an RGB colors are red, green, and blue. So if I just max out red and zero out everything else, it's just going to end up red. So I have my definition of red. And that should be good for my score surface. Now I need to, down in my draw code, draw the score surface onto the screen. We're going to use a screen method called blit, which just transfers pixels onto a screen. It's essentially drawing it. So screen.blit score surface. And it takes another argument, a list or a tuple of the XY coordinates where you want to draw this object. So I want this to be in the upper left corner. So I'll say 0, 0. And it should be drawing the score. So let me run. You can see it says score 0, and every time I hit the ball, it updates the score. Okay, now if I miss the ball, what I want it to do is say game over, and it currently doesn't. So that's the next thing to do. And in order to take care of that, I'm going to first define what happens when the game ends. I'll define a game over function. So make sure this is unindented. It's not a method. It's not part of any of these classes. We're going to define game over. It'll need to know some things about the ball, so I'm going to pass it the ball as an argument later when I call it. And what I'll do is set ball x speed to 0, ball y speed to 0. I'm going to create a game over font. I'll make this a little bit larger than the score font. And when it renders, I'm going to render the text game over. And this will also be red. I will blit the game over surface onto the screen, which just means draw it onto the screen. And I'll put it at 200, 200. So it'll be somewhat almost centered, a little bit to the left and top. All right. And then what I need to do is, now that I've got a definition of I've defined what I want to happen when the game is over, I need to call it where that's relevant. So where is it relevant? It's when the ball gets past the paddle. The ball gets past the paddle when it's at the bottom, when its y value is at the screen height. So this right here, self.y greater than or equal to screen height, is actually it's the game over condition. So what I'm going to do is just cut this or and all of this out. It shouldn't be here anymore. I don't need the ball to bounce when it reaches the bottom. I need it to end the game. So I will cut that away. I can still have it bounce when y is less than or equal to 0. But up at the top here, one of the first things, I don't want it to be able to bounce when it reaches the bottom. I want the first condition that it checks to be the thing I just cut. So I'll just paste it there. If self.y is greater than or equal to screen height, get rid of this or, that means the game should be over. So I'm going to call game over, and I will pass it a reference to itself. Because remember, this is all happening inside the ball object's move method. So I need to pass a reference to that ball to the game over function. All right, so I think this should work. I can still hit the ball. It still keeps score, but if I miss the ball, I have a crash. What did I do? Pygame.font. I just misspelled sysfont, and I closed it. Okay, my problem was I misspelled sysfont. Uppercase F. Save. Run. Miss the ball again. Game over. Let's see, I also misspelled Georgia. I really have a lot of spelling errors here. I also misspelled Georgia, which is why it was displaying in sort of the system default. It was something just sort of basic sans serif font. Let me try that now that I spelled Georgia correctly. And I get the font that I wanted. Okay, so fixed those errors. Now, what's left? So the game keeps score. It ends when you miss. The only thing that's really missing is what happens if what happens if sort of over time the game starts to get boring. Well, it shouldn't be the same all the time. The game should get harder over time, so it's more of a challenge and it's more interesting to play. So what I'm going to do is just have every time every time the ball collides, what I'll do is I'll just increase speed a little bit. That shouldn't be too difficult to do. I have my collision right here. When the ball collides with the paddle, when the ball collides with the paddle, this is a good time to increase the speed. The Y speed is always going to be reversed, and then what I'll also do with the Y speed, kind of take care of this anyway. I'm going to keep my speed code, try to group it together as much as possible. I'm going to cut speed out. I'm going to cut score and just separate it from the speed related code, just for the sake of keeping like things together. And I'll say after I negate y speed, another thing I'll do with y speed is self.y speed. When it bounces, it's always going to be negative. What happens is when the ball's going down, its speed is positive. Remember, inverted y-axis. The y values go up as the ball moves down. So the y speed is always positive when the ball's going down, and when it hits the paddle, it flips and goes and becomes negative right here. So what I can do with the y speed is just always subtract a little bit to make it go a little faster. So I minus equals 1. Let's just try it and see what happens. Minus equals 1. It's actually kind of significantly faster already. I only hit the ball a couple times and it's getting pretty fast. I think this game would get really hard really quickly. It'll become unplayable after just a few points. So not quite what I want. So I'll have it speed up a little bit more slowly. I'll say 0.2. I think that should be manageable. And I'll do something similar for the X. X is a little more complex because it's not always going to be going the same direction. It might be moving right to left, or it might be moving left to right. So what I'll do here is I'll say if self.xSpeed greater than 0, that means it's moving to the right. I want to increase it. I want to increase it in the positive direction. So I'll say self dot x speed plus equals 0.2. Else, it's never going to have a 0 speed when it's colliding. So I don't really need to worry about that. If it's not positive, it's just going to be negative. The alternative, I should just take. It's always going to. The alternative is it's a negative speed. It's moving to the left, so I can say self dot x speed minus equals 0.2. So now it should get a little bit faster over time. All right, and at this point, it's a more or less finished game. You could see a couple ways to expand on this. Right now, it's very simple and it's just a one-player game. Another way you could modify this and make it a little bit better is you could add an extra feature. You could add an extra feature to add some sort of restart. It doesn't really restart. It just ends. It would be pretty straightforward to, after the game over point, have a key that you press to restart the game and to reset the score to 0 and reset the ball speed and the ball location and have it go. Another way you could expand on this would be to add at the beginning an option, maybe a little bit of display, a little bit of a menu for one, press 1 for one player, press 2 for two player, and you could have a 2-player game, more like traditional Pong with 2 paddles, one on the left, one on the right, and if you score on somebody, you get a point. So instead of this sort of very simplistic Pong, you could make it more like the original arcade game. Those are just a couple ways that you could take this basic starter and expand on it and make it into something. And another thing you could another thing to look into that could be interesting is storing data in files, and you could store a high score or something like that, and keep track of, have the high score be persistent if you store that the highest score in a file and look up that file. Anyway, this is just a basic starter. It's sort of a basic example of how to make this game. From this point, you should be able to use the things you know about Pygame, the things you know about Python to make more interesting games or added functionality and that kind of thing to make it more interesting. So hope this was helpful.